I beg you, and if fast." The dying man's words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Jacob Morrison stood over him, his hand on his Colt .45, facing an impossible choice. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life, but not in the way you'd expect. This is the true story of a lonely rancher in 1887 who did the unthinkable when a dying stranger begged him for mercy. But first, you need to understand how these two men's paths crossed in the Arizona desert, and why Jake Morrison had been dying long before he ever met Thomas Whitaker. The sun hung low over the Arizona territory in the summer of 1887, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Jacob Morrison Hero, folks called him Jake Hero, stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, a tin cup of bitter coffee cooling in his calloused hands. 42 years old and widowed for 3 years, he had built this ranch from nothing with his late wife Martha. But now, it felt like a monument to loneliness. 2,000 acres of scrubland, 100 head of cattle, and a silence so complete it threatened to swallow him whole. The drought had been merciless that summer. His creek had become cracked mud, his cattle were growing thin, and Jake knew he was one bad season away from losing everything. But it wasn't the failing ranch that kept him awake at night. It was the emptiness of the house behind Himuro, the bedroom where Martha had taken her last breath, the kitchen where her laughter used to echo, the rocking chair where she'd sit while the sun set. Jake was about to head inside when he heard something that didn't belong in his world of wind and cattle. A human voice, weak and desperate, calling out from beyond his northern fence. "Help, please, somebody." The voice was faint but unmistakable. Jake's hand went instinctively to the Colt .45 on his hip as he moved toward the sound. Years on the frontier had taught him caution. But what he found wasn't a 3D Euro. It was a tragedy unfolding in the desert heat. A young man lay collapsed near Jake's fence line, his body twisted in obvious agony. His horse stood nearby, head hanging low, clearly exhausted. As Jake approached, he could see the man was in his late 20s, well-dressed in city clothes now, torn and dust-covered. More importantly, Jake saw the dark stains spreading across the man's midsection Euro, a gunshot wound, and from the looks of it, a fatal one. "Easy there, friend," Jake said, kneeling beside him. "Let me see how bad it is." The young man's eyes, glazed with pain and fear, focused on Jake's face. "No, don't, it's too late." His voice was barely a whisper. Jake pulled back the man's jacket, and his heart sank. The bullet had torn through the abdomen, likely puncturing vital organs. This man was bleeding internally, and Jake knew from experience that this kind of injury meant hours of excruciating pain before death finally came. "Please," the dying man gasped, each word costing him tremendous effort. "I'm begging you, just end it fast. Make it quick. I can't, the pain." Jake's mind reeled. In all his years on the frontier, he had faced many difficult situations: drought, stampedes, encounters with outlaws. But this was asking him to become an executioner. "Who did this to you?" Jake asked. "Are they still out there?" The man shook his head weakly. "Robbery, stage holdup, 3 men. They took everything. Shot me when I tried to fight back. Rode off thinking I was already dead." He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "Please, mister, I've seen men die from belly wounds. Takes hours, days sometimes. I can't endure it. If you have any mercy." Jake sat back on his heels. He had put down injured horses and cattle before a Euro. It was part of ranch life. But a man? That crossed a line he'd never imagined having to face. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked quietly. "Thomas. Thomas Whitaker. From Philadelphia. Came west to start fresh. Stupid. So stupid. You got family back in Philadelphia, Thomas?" Jake asked. The young man's eyes filled with tears. "Mother, father, sister Mary. They didn't want me to come. Begged me to stay. Now, they'll get a telegram saying I died out here. Alone." His body convulsed with pain, and he let out a strangled cry. "Please, for God's sake, end it. I'm begging you." Jake looked around the empty landscape, as if hoping for divine intervention. But there was no thing Euro, just endless desert, the setting sun, and a dying man pleading for release. "Thomas, listen to me," Jake said, his voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "I'm going to take you to my house. I've got laudanum for Pinayuro, and no." Thomas's vehemence surprised them both. "You know that won't be enough. I've seen men with wounds like this. The laudanum just dulls it. I'll still be conscious, still feel it, for hours." Tears streamed down his face. "I was going to marry a girl named Sarah. We had plans, dreams. Now I'm dying in the dirt like a dog. If you have any compassion, don't make me suffer through hours of agony. Please, I'm begging you as one man to another. End it fast." Jake removed his hat and ran his hand through his graying hair. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. In his younger days, before Martha, before the ranch, Jake had been in gunfights, had killed men who were trying to kill him. But that was different Euro. That was survival, self-defense. This was being asked to deliberately end a life, even if it was to prevent suffering. "If I do this," Jake said slowly, "I'm not sure I can live with it. You understand that? You're asking me to carry this weight for the rest of my days." Thomas reached out with a trembling hand and grasped Jake's wrist with surprising strength. "And if you don't, I'll suffer for hours, maybe days. Which burden is heavier, your guilt or my agony?" He coughed more blood. "I'm dead already, mister. You know it, I know it. You'd just be shortening the timeline. That's all. Mercy, not murder." Jake looked into the young man's eyes and saw genuine terror, not fear of death itself, but fear of the long, agonizing journey toward it. Jake thought about Martha in her final days, wasting away from consumption. She had begged him to, near the end, when the pain became too much. "Jake," she had whispered, "if you love me, help me go peaceful." But he hadn't been able to do it. He'd held her hand through the worst of it, fed her laudanum until it ran out, watched her suffer for days before her body finally gave up. He'd regretted that inaction every day since. He'd told himself he was being moral, following God's law, respecting the sanctity of life. But in the darkest hours of the night, he wondered if he'd been a coward Euro, if he'd put his own moral comfort above Martha's suffering. The memory haunted him still Euro, Martha's labored breathing, her hollow eyes, the way she'd looked at him with such desperate hope that he might end her pain. And he'd failed her. He'd let her suffer because he was too weak, too afraid of his own conscience. "All right, Thomas," Jake said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "But first, you're going to tell me everything. Your mother's name, your father's name, your sister Mary's full name, where they live in Philadelphia, what your Sarah looks like, everything. I'm going to write it all down, and I'm going to make sure they know you didn't die alone. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded, relief and gratitude flooding his pain-ravaged face. Yes, thank you. God bless you, mister." Jake carefully lifted Thomas and carried him to his ranch house. Despite trying to be gentle, every movement caused the young man to cry out in pain. The short distance felt like miles, each step deliberate, each jolt sending fresh waves of agony through the dying man. Jake's strong arms held firm, supporting the weight of a stranger who had become something more in these terrible moments Euro, a responsibility, a trust, a fellow human being in desperate need. Jake laid Thomas on the porch as gently as possible, then went inside for paper, pencil, and his bottle of whiskey. He also retrieved a clean blanket and pillow, making Thomas as comfortable as possible. For the next 20 minutes, Thomas talked. His voice grew weaker with each sentence, but he pushed through, determined to leave something of himself behind. He spoke of his mother, Catherine, a schoolteacher who loved poetry, his father, William, a carpenter who'd built their family home with his own hands, his sister, Mary, 16 years old, who wanted to be a nurse, and Sarah Euro, beautiful Sarah with chestnut hair and green eyes, who loved to paint watercolors of flowers, who laughed at his terrible jokes, who had cried when he told her he was heading west. Jake wrote it all down in his careful, unpracticed handwriting, making sure every detail was preserved. Tell them Thomas's voice was barely audible now. Tell them I thought of them at the end. Tell them I'm sorry for being foolish. Tell Sarah to marry someone good. Someone who won't run off chasing dreams in the desert. Are you ready? Jake asked, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Wait, Thomas whispered. What's your name? I should know the name of the man showing me mercy. Jacob Morrison. Folks call me Jake. Thank you, Jake Morrison. I'll put in a good word for you, wherever I'm going. Thomas managed a weak smile. Do it while I'm looking at the sunset. Martha would have liked that too. The mention of Martha hit Jake like a fist to the chest, but he nodded. He helped Thomas adjust so he could see the western horizon, where the sun was painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. It's beautiful, Thomas murmured. Almost makes it worth it. Coming west, seeing skies like this. Jake stood and drew his Colt. Close your eyes, son. Think about Sarah. Think about going home. Thomas closed his eyes, his lips moving in prayer, or perhaps Sarah's name. Jake raised the revolver, his hand steady despite the storm inside him. He aimed at Thomas's temple, knowing it would be instant, painless. His finger tightened on the trigger, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Jake Morrison stood frozen between mercy and murder. Then he did something completely unexpected. He lowered the gun. I can't, Jake said, his voice breaking. God forgive me, Thomas, but I can't do it. I can't deliberately take your life, even to end your suffering. I thought I could, but I can't. Thomas's eyes flew open, and Jake saw a flash of betrayal there, followed by resignation. Then I'll die here in agony, for hours. No, Jake said firmly. You won't die alone, and you won't die in agony. I'm going to stay with you, and I'm going to give you every drop of laudanum I have. It might not take all the pain away, but it'll help. And I'm going to talk to you about Sarah, about your family, about Philadelphia. I'm going to make sure that when you go, you're thinking about love, not pain. That's what I can give you. That's the only mercy I know how to offer. This was the unthinkable thing Jake Morrison died a euro, not ending a life as requested, but choosing to share in suffering, to offer presence instead of release, to let death come in its own time while making that time bearable. Jake went inside and returned with his medical supplies euro, a small bottle of laudanum he'd kept since Martha's illness, some clean cloths, and water. He administered the laudanum, probably more than was strictly safe, but safety wasn't the concern now. As the drug took effect, Thomas's breathing eased slightly, and the tension in his face lessened. Jake wet the cloths and cleaned the young man's face, wiping away the dust and blood with gentle, deliberate motions. These were the small dignities he could offer Euro: clean skin, reduced pain, companionship. Then Jake sat beside Thomas, back against the porch post, and began to talk. He told Thomas about his own journey west, about meeting Martha at a church social in Missouri, about their decision to homestead in Arizona territory. He described building this ranch from nothing, the hard winters and brutal summers, the satisfaction of watching something grow from your own sweat and determination. Jake talked about Martha's death and the hollow ache it left behind, about how some mornings he still set 2 cups out for coffee before remembering she was gone. Loneliness, Jake said quietly, is its own kind of death, slower than your bullet wound, but just as certain. Since Martha passed, I've been dying by inches, going through the motions. You asked me to end your suffering fast, but Thomas, I wonder sometimes if the slow death isn't worse. Thomas's hand found Jake's. His grip was weak but deliberate. They were both dying, just different speeds. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The laudanum had taken Thomas to a place beyond pain, though Jake knew it was temporary. 2 men who had been strangers hours ago now sat together, sharing the weight of mortality, the reality of suffering, and the strange comfort of not being alone. In that moment, they weren't rancher and stranger. They were simply 2 human beings facing the inevitable together. Jake. Thomas's voice was dreamy now, distant, the laudanum carrying him away. I see her. I see Sarah. She's wearing her blue dress, the one I liked. She's smiling. Jake's throat tightened. That's good, son. You go to her. And Martha's there too, Thomas continued, his words slurring slightly. She says you did the right thing. She says mercy isn't always quick. Sometimes it's just being there. Jake felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You tell Martha I miss her every day. She knows. She says she's waiting. Says not to be alone so long. I'll try, Thomas. You rest now." The young man's breathing changed euro, longer pauses between breaths, each one shallower than the last. Jake held Thomas's hand and continued talking, his voice steady despite his tears. He talked about the sunrise over the desert, about the sound of cattle moving through the canyon, about the taste of Martha's apple pie, about anything and everything that spoke of life and love and beauty. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew deep, Thomas Whitaker did euro, not from a bullet as he'd begged, but from his wounds, in the company of a stranger who'd become something like a friend in his final hours. When Jake finally felt the hand in his go, completely still, when the last breath rattled out and didn't return, he sat for a long moment in the darkness. The silence that followed was different from the lonely silence Jake had known for 3 years. This was a silence of completion, of a journey ended, of a duty fulfilled. Jake had given Thomas what he could euro, not the quick death he'd requested, but something perhaps more valuable, the assurance that he wasn't alone, that his life mattered enough for someone to sit with him through the darkness, that his last moments would be filled with thoughts of love rather than terror of pain. Jake went inside and retrieved his bibliuro, the one he and Martha had shared, its pages worn from years of Sunday readings. He returned to the porch and, by lantern light, read the 23rd Psalm over Thomas Whitaker's body. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Jake's voice, rough with emotion and cigarette smoke, carried the ancient words into the night air. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." When he finished, Jake sat with the body until dawn began to pink the eastern horizon. He wasn't sure why euro, perhaps to make sure Thomas truly wasn't alone, perhaps to process what had happened, perhaps to pray for forgiveness for what he'd done or hadn't done. As the first light touched the desert, Jake knew what he had to do next. Jake spent the rest of that night and early morning digging a gravy euro, not in the empty desert where Thomas had fallen, but in a pleasant spot behind his house where wildflowers grew in the spring and a cottonwood tree provided shade. His muscles ached, sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool night air, but he didn't stop. This young man from Philadelphia deserved better than an unmarked grave in the wasteland. Each shovelful of dirt was a kind of prayer, each swing of the pickaxe through hard-packed earth a meditation on life and death and the responsibilities we bear for one another. By the time the sun was fully risen, Jake had created a proper gravy road deep enough to protect from scavengers, positioned to face east toward the sunrise, located where someone might visit and remember. He marked it with a wooden cross he fashioned from spare lumber, carefully carving Thomas's name, his dates, and Philadelphia into the wood with his pocket knife. At dawn, Jake buried Thomas Whitaker with as much dignity as he could manage. He wrapped the body carefully in his best blankie euro, the one Martha had made their first year on the Rancho Euro, and lowered it gently into the earth. Standing over the open grave with his hat removed, Jake said what prayers he remembered from his church-going days, then added some words of his own. "Lord, this here is Thomas Whitaker. He came west looking for a new beginning and found his end instead. But he died brave and thinking of those he loved. I ask you to welcome him home and let him know that someone cared enough to see him properly buried. Let his family know somehow that he wasn't alone. And forgive me, Lord, for what I did or didn't do. I try to show mercy the only way I knew how." Jake filled in the grave as the sun climbed higher, each shovelful of dirt a final farewell to a young man whose name he would never forget. The next morning, Jake rode into Town Euro, a hard day's journey across unforgiving territory. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his horse moved steadily but slowly through the heat. Jake had time to think during that long ride, replaying the previous night's events over and over. Had he done the right thing? Would Thomas have preferred the quick death he'd begged for? Or had Jake's choice to stay, to offer presence and comfort, been its own kind of mercy? He didn't have answers, only the weight of the decision and the memory of a young man's hand growing cold in his. When Jake finally reached town, he went straight to the telegraph office. The clerk looked up from his desk with surprise. Jake Morrison rarely came to town, and when he did, he certainly didn't send telegrams. But Jake had made a promise to a dying man, and promises, once made, were sacred bonds not to be broken. Jake sent a telegram to William and Catherine Whitaker in Philadelphia. His hand shook slightly as he wrote out the words, knowing that these brief sentences would shatter a family's world. Your son Thomas died in Arizona territory. Gunshot wound from stage robbery. He was not alone. Made comfortable his final hours. Last thoughts were of you and his intended Sarah. Buried with respect on my ranch. My deepest condolences. Jacob Morrison, rancher. He sent another telegram to Sarah, whose last name and address Thomas had provided between gasps of pain. Thomas Whitaker passed in my care. His last word was your name. He wanted you to know he loved you to the end. Deepest sympathies. Jacob Morrison. Jake also reported the stage robbery to the territorial marshal, describing the three men as best he could from Thomas's limited description. It wasn't much to go on. The frontier was vast, and outlaws knew how to disappear. But Jake owed it to Thomas to try, to make sure that if justice could be served, it would be. When Jake returned to his ranch 3 days later, the first thing he did was visit Thomas's grave. The wooden cross stood straight and solid, the earth around it still fresh and dark. Jake stood there for a long time, hat in hands, not quite praying, but not quite just thinking either something in between. I've been thinking about what you said, Jake told the grave, feeling foolish talking to the ground but doing it anyway. About loneliness being a slow death. I think you were right, Thomas. I think I've been dying by inches since Martha passed, too stubborn or scared to admit it. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the empty landscape. You asked me for mercy, and I couldn't give you what you wanted. But maybe mercy isn't always about ending something. Maybe sometimes it's about enduring something, being present for the hard parts, sitting with someone in their pain instead of trying to make it disappear. The sun sank lower, and Jake realized he'd been standing there for over an hour. Over the following weeks, something shifted in Jake Morrison. He threw himself into ranch work with renewed purpose, not out of desperation or habit, but because he realized he had a choice. He could die slowly like Thomas said, or he could actually live. He hired a drifter named Carlos who'd been passing through looking for work. The ranch was too much for one man anyway, Jake told himself, though the truth was that he missed having another voice around, missed the simple companionship of sharing meals and swapping stories. Carlos was a good worker, quiet but reliable, with his own stories of loss and survival. They developed an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day, sharing simple dinners in the evening, each man respecting the other's occasional need for silence. Jake started attending church again in town, something he'd avoided since Martha's death, because being in the place they'd worshipped together hurt too much. But Thomas had been right. Jake was dying alone out here, and maybe that was the worst death after all. 3 months after burying Thomas Whitaker, Jake received a letter from Philadelphia. The envelope was fine paper, addressed in elegant handwriting that spoke of education and refinement. Inside, Catherine Whitaker's words were carefully composed despite the grief evident between the lines. She thanked Jake for his kindness to their son, for ensuring he wasn't alone, for giving him dignity in death. She described Thomas as their only son, their pride and joy, the boy who'd been too adventurous for his own good, but whose heart had always been pure. She mentioned the $3,000 Thomas had been carrying to money from selling his share in his uncle's business, meant to start his new life. You asked nothing of us, expected no reward, she wrote, yet you gave our boy something precious, companionship in his darkest moment. The letter included a photograph of Thomas, taken before he left for the West. He looked happy and hopeful, dressed in good clothes, his whole life ahead of him. Jake stared at that photograph for a long time, then placed it carefully in his Bible. Jake did something unexpected. He wrote to Sarah. It took him 3 tries to get the words right a euro. He wasn't a man comfortable with writing, especially writing to a grieving woman he'd never met. But something Thomas had said in his final hours kept echoing in Jake's mind. "Dear Miss Sarah," he finally wrote, "I was with Thomas Whitaker when he passed. He talked about you a lot, about your chestnut hair and green eyes, about your watercolor paintings, about your laugh. He loved you very much. He asked me to tell you to marry someone good, someone who wouldn't run off chasing dreams in the desert. But I've been thinking about that advice, and I wonder if he'd really want you to play it safe. Thomas came west because he had dreams euro, genuine, good dreams, even if they ended badly. Maybe he'd want you to find someone who also has dreams, who also has courage euro, just someone luckier than he was. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because Thomas made me think about my own life, about living versus just existing. He changed something in me. Your Thomas made a difference, even at the end." Jake sealed the letter and rode to town to post it, feeling lighter somehow for having written it. One Sunday after church, Jake found himself in conversation with Eleanor Hartfield, a widow who ran the general store in town. She was maybe 5 years younger than Jake, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner he appreciated. She wore her widowhood with dignity, neither hiding her past nor being consumed by it. When she mentioned that her buckboard needed repair and she couldn't afford the blacksmith's prices, Jake found himself offering to fix it. "I'm pretty good with my hands," he said, then immediately felt foolish for stating something so obvious. Eleanor smiled euro, not a sad smile or a forced smile, but a genuine one that reached her eyes. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps you'd let me pay you in meals? I make a decent pot roast, and I suspect a bachelor rancher doesn't eat as well as he should." That repair job led to another conversation, which led to Jake inviting Eleanor to Sunday dinner at the ranch, which led to a courtship that surprised everyone, including Jake himself. He wasn't looking for love euro, wasn't sure he deserved it after Martha. But Eleanor was patient and understanding. Eleanor became a regular visitor to the ranch, joining Jake and Carlos for Sunday dinners, helping with small tasks around the house, bringing life back to rooms that had been silent too long. She never tried to replace Martha or make Jake forget her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset euro, the same porch where Thomas Whitaker had died over a year ago euro, Eleanor turned to Jake with her characteristic directness. "Martha was your first love," she said gently. "I'm not trying to be her. I'm just trying to be someone you can walk forward with, instead of standing still." Jake took her hand, rough calluses meeting soft skin. "I spent 3 years dying slowly," he said. "Then a stranger taught me the difference between ending and enduring, between quick mercy and lasting presence. You're teaching me something 2 that it's possible to honor the past while building a future." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "That young man's grave behind your house you visited often. Tell me about him." And so Jake told her about Thomas, about the impossible choice, about the weight of decisions. Eleanor listened without judgment, understanding somehow that this story was important, that the grave represented more than just a buried stranger. 2 years after Thomas's death, Jake and Eleanor were married in a small ceremony in town. It wasn't a grand affair neither of them wanted that. Just close friends, Carlos, who had become like family, and a few townspeople who'd known them both through their times of grief. Among the congratulations that arrived was a telegram from Catherine and William Whitaker in Philadelphia, offering blessings from strangers who felt like friends. Sarah sent a letter too, mentioning that she had married Dr. Henry and was expecting their first child. "Thomas would be happy for us both," she wrote. "He'd be glad to know his story helped you find life again." As Jake stood at the altar with Eleanor, he thought about the strange paths life takes, about how death and life are intertwined, about how a dying stranger's plea had paradoxically taught him about living. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about building futures together, and Jake felt Martha's absence not as a wound, but as a blessing. She had been his first chapter, and Eleanor was his second, and both were sacred. On his wedding night, Jake stood by Thomas's grave one last time as a single man. The wildflowers were in bloom, and the cottonwood tree rustled in the evening breeze. He placed his hand on the wooden cross, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm. "You were right about a lot of things, Thomas," Jake said quietly. "About loneliness being its own kind of death. About the importance of not being alone. I couldn't give you what you asked for that euro. I couldn't end it fast. But maybe I gave you something else. Maybe I gave you someone to be with in the darkness, someone to remind you of light." He paused, thinking about that terrible night and the decision he'd made. "I used to wonder if I did the right thing, refusing your request. But I don't wonder anymore. Mercy isn't always quick and clean. Sometimes it's messy and hard, and it takes time. Sometimes mercy is just staying, being present, choosing to live even when dying seems easier." A hawk cried overhead, circling in the dimming sky. "Thank you for that lesson. Thank you for making me think about my own slow death and giving me the courage to choose life instead." Years passed, and Jake Morrison grew old. His hair turned white, his back bent slightly from decades of hard work, but his eyes remained clear and kind. The ranch prospered under his and Eleanor's partnership. Carlos became foreman, then partner, his own family growing alongside Jake's. Eleanor brought children into Jake's euro, not their own, but her nieces and nephews who visited often, filling the house with noise and laughter that would have delighted Martha. And then came grandchildren euro, Carlos's kids, and Eleanor's relatives, children euro, who treated Jake like the grandfather they all loved. One afternoon, sitting on that same porch where everything had changed decades ago, surrounded by playing children, Jake found himself telling the story of Thomas Whitaker. The younger grandchildren lost interest quickly, running off to chase chickens, but Oni Euro, a thoughtful boy of about 12 euro, stayed to listen. When Jake finished, the boy asked the question that haunted the story. "Did you do the right thing, Grandpa?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the same desert where Thomas Whitaker had died so many years ago. "I did what I could live with," Jake finally answered, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "And maybe that's all any of us can do euro. Make the choices we can live with, then live with them as best we can." Thomas wanted a quick end to his suffering. I couldn't give him that, but I gave him company, comfort, and care. I made sure he wasn't alone. Sometimes that's the only mercy we can offer euro, not to take the pain away, but to sit with someone while they bear it. The grandchild seemed satisfied with that answer, and Jake returned his gaze to the sunset. He thought about Thomas, about Martha, about all the people who had shaped his life through their presence and their absence. "The loneliest thing," Jake continued, almost to himself, "isn't dying. It's living without connection, without purpose, without love. Thomas taught me that. He was dying fast, and I was dying slow, and somehow we saved each author him by reminding me what mattered, me by showing him he mattered enough to be remembered." Under the cottonwood tree, the wooden cross had weathered and worn over the years, but Jake had kept it repaired and painted. Thomas Whitaker's grave was never forgotten, never abandoned. Thomas Whitaker's grave stood as a reminder that we are, in the end, responsible for each author euro, not to make all pain disappear, not to have all the answers, but simply to be present, to bear witness, to offer what comfort we can in an often harsh and unforgiving world. And in that wild, beautiful, terrible country of the Old West, that was the most unthinkable, radical thing Jake Morrison could have done. He chose connection over isolation, compassion over convenience, and life over the slow death of loneliness. When Jake's time finally came peacefully in his sleep at age 87, surrounded by familia, they buried him beside Martha, just as he'd requested. But at his funeral, Eleanor made sure to tell the story of Thomas Whitaker, the young man whose death had taught Jake Morrison how to truly live. Thomas's final gift wasn't just teaching Jake about mercy it was teaching him how to live again. And that grave beneath the cottonwood tree, tended now by Jake's descendants, remained as a testament to an impossible choice, a moment of grace, and the understanding that mercy comes in many forms sometimes quick, but sometimes slow, patient, and present. The lonely rancher had done the unthinkable, and in doing so, had saved not one life but two, The dying man who passed knowing he mattered, and the living man who learned to live again. Thomas Whitaker's grave stood as a reminder that we are, in the end, responsible for each author euro, not to make all pain disappear, not to have all the answers, but simply to be present, to bear witness, to offer what comfort we can in an often harsh and unforgiving world. And in that wild, beautiful, terrible country of the Old West, that was the most unthinkable, radical thing Jake Morrison could have done. He chose connection over isolation, compassion over convenience, and life over the slow death of loneliness. When Jake's time finally came euro, peacefully in his sleep at age 87, surrounded by familiar, they buried him beside Martha, just as he'd requested. But at his funeral, Eleanor made sure to tell the story of Thomas Whitaker, the young man whose death had taught Jake Morrison how to truly live. Thomas's final gift wasn't just teaching Jake about mercy euro, it was teaching him how to live again. And that grave beneath the cottonwood tree, tended now by Jake's descendants, remained as a testament to an impossible choice, a moment of grace, and the understanding that mercy comes in many forms euro, sometimes quick, but sometimes slow, patient, and present. The lonely rancher had done the unthinkable, and in doing so, had saved not one life, but two. The dying man who passed knowing he mattered, and the living man who learned to live again. This story reminds us that in our darkest moments, when we face impossible choices, the answer isn't always clear or simple. Sometimes mercy looks different than we expect. Sometimes compassion means enduring alongside someone rather than ending their pain. And sometimes the most radical act of love is simply being present, fully present, for another human being's suffering. Jake Morrison learned that loneliness kills slowly but surely, and that connection to euro, even with a dying stranger euro, can save a life. Thomas Whitaker learned that even in death, we are not alone if someone chooses to stay. And we, hearing their story across the decades, learn that every choice we make ripples forward through time, touching lives we'll never meet, creating legacies we can't imagine. In the Wild West of 1887, two men met by chance, and through their brief encounter, both found mercy euro, one in a peaceful death surrounded by care, the other in the rediscovery of life's purpose. Thank you for listening to this story. May we all have the wisdom to know when to act, and when to simply be present, when to end things and when to endure them, and may we never underestimate the power of choosing connection over isolation, even when especially when it's the harder choice.